It's funny, when I finished making part one of this series on creativity, my brain made me feel like I was all ready to just continue into part two right away. But then I followed my own advice on creativity, and I actually took about another 2 days, and I'm very pleased with the results. And I have a lot more clarity to share with you about what I, in essence, understood before, but in another way, I didn't understand it all before because I have a lot more detail and I can explain it much better to you now. We'll talk about today regarding creative idea making can help you improve any part of your life, even parts that you don't realize need improvement. But for example, if you want to make a sales letter or an affiliate website where you're promoting someone else's product, then you, of course, want to make that as good as you can. And what we'll talk about today will be effective in that. If you're certainly in your relationships with other people, then in terms of figuring out what's important to them or just what a communication would mean to them rather than to yourself, then that falls under the category of this type of creativity as well. So the best way to explain what I mean is to continue onward. We have a number of slides here. All right, I'm going to introduce what I mean by creativity here by comparing it to the default way that your brain would have handled any particular situation, such as communicating with someone or making a web page or figuring out what to do at a particular moment in a day or during a day itself, or really solving any particular problem or realizing to improve on things that might have seemed okay, but could have really been improved on. There's all sorts of things like that in our lives where our lives could be much better and much easier, except that we're squelching questions that we could be asking. Now, a very important part of the law of implication model for understanding the world, which you may or may not be very familiar with. If you're just watching this series, you might not be deeply familiar with it. But just to give you a quick sense of it is, and you might have heard me say it by now, is that you are not your brain, not at all. Now, your brain is what thinks. So you don't actually think, your brain does. Your brain's extremely important to your life and your quality of your life and everything, right? It's utterly integral and again, you don't do any thinking. Your brain does all the thinking. Ultimately then, what interests me, because it's the core of our opportunity in life as ourselves, not our brains, is how do we interfere or interact with our brains in order to make our lives much better, and also the people that we affect, how to make their lives much better. Generally, the way people live their entire life, their brain goes along doing what it would do by default. And by default, that our brain, starting from when we're born, basically picks up ideas and beliefs and, in quotes, knowledge. Knowledge isn't exactly things that we literally know are true, but they're things that are stored in our mind as either true or probably true or whatever. Little facts, like you can know a fact that might actually be false, right? Or something that like you think a fact. Anyway, all of that stuff gets accumulated in our mind, in our brain, in our mind, whatever, as we're growing up. And based on that, our bodies, we just go forward in life. We get the results that we get. And now people are, of course, conscious. We do have a conscious part of our brain, but that part of our brain is not in and of itself conscious. That's the part of the brain that's responsible most directly for what comes into our consciousness field, for what we become aware of. Generally, the way that people live their lives is they only interfere consciously with their brains within a small range that their brain allows them to interfere in. And they don't question outside of that. They don't create and take advantage of potential opportunities outside of that. And one of the very strong pieces of evidence that's the case is that people almost universally, or pretty much literally universally, don't stop and try to figure out what's really going on in existence, and particularly don't ask the question, how can I know for absolute certain what's true? How can I make the world absolutely perfect, and what might that mean? How people don't just stop and take as long as it takes to try to figure out what's the methodology, what's the best possible methodology for thinking. And everyone would come to the conclusion to ask those questions if they didn't just stay within the narrow range that their brain gives them of questions to ask and what to consciously decide and so forth. Because logically, you always come to those questions if you're genuinely trying to solve any issue in life. Whenever you start to unravel problems, you eventually are going to start making assertions about, I know this, I know that. And you're, of course, going to be thinking, right, while you're doing it and while you're trying to solve a problem. And then if you really were trying to solve the problem as effectively and deeply as possible, you would start to ask the question, wait a second, what's the best method for thinking? And you wouldn't just take the first answer that comes to mind, or even the answer that comes to mind after a year of working at it hard. You would keep working on it until you found some way to be certain of getting it right. And in order to be certain of getting it right, you'd have to ask the question, how do I even recognize whether I'm correctly certain? How do I know things? The farthest you can get from the default functioning of your brain is to realize the absolute priority and absolute importance of asking the question that can be phrased in many different ways. And then I introduced this in the free videos that I have available, the 2 free intro videos. In essence, the ultimate in creativity is asking those questions of, how do I know what's true? What's the methodology for knowing what's true, for distinguishing good ideas from ideas that I don't know or that are bad? Or how do I think most accurately? Those are all the similar question. How might I make the world perfect? Okay, those all are the core of what we should be coming to creatively. Now, I'm not going to keep dwelling on the core in this video and in this whole video series, the whole money getting video series. I'm not going to dwell on that, but I needed to mention that to you. So ideally, you get all the way to the core and then you start to build back up. However, now we're going to put that aside and I'm going to come back to what I started talking about, which is that your brain is going to deal with any particular situation by default. There's something it's going to do by default, and it's not going to be totally ridiculous. Sometimes it will be, but for example, if you're going to make an affiliate website where you're trying to make money by sending people over to buy someone else's product, then without being creative, you'll do some sort of a job on it, and your brain, your body will do some sort of a job. And that job might be fairly, interestingly enough, if you try to be creative at first, you might even come up with things that don't work as well. But eventually you'll do better, and almost certainly you'll do better. But regardless, your brain, and a good way to think of this for now that makes it simple to picture is basically think of it as your subconscious brain, your subconscious brain, and that is going to direct you and come up with a way of doing things, and that's going to have some result. Same thing if you're communicating with someone, or if you want somebody to like you, or if you're in a relationship and you're trying to do something nice for the other person, then you're going to come up with something, and it's going to be some amount of effective based. And if you're not creative about it, then whatever you do, it isn't necessarily going to be wrong, but it's going to be a result of all of the knowledge and beliefs and so forth that your brain's absorbed into your subconscious for your whole life, right? And then it's just going to use that and do the best it can. And I'll talk a little bit about how it does that in another slide or two. So it's critical to understand this idea of default, and in order to understand, and in order for me to construct for you the meaning of creativity. In the law of implication methodology, I don't define words with other words. I don't just say creativity is and then give you a bunch of other words, because all I've done is just use a bunch of other words that are ill-defined or ill-understood, that aren't constructed, in order to define another word. So I didn't really get very far. It looked like I did something, but it wasn't very effective. Instead, in the law of implication methodology, we construct the meanings of words. And I'm actually doing that for you now with what I'm talking about with creativity. In order to construct the meaning of creativity, I had to point out that our brain and our body will go do something based on everything that has happened in the past, based on the implication of everything that's happened in the past. The implication being what got programmed into your brain based on your environment. And based on whatever conscious things you've done in the past that would have resulted in changes to your mind as well. So whatever the end result of all of that is, then that's what you're going to do by default in a new situation. Then creativity is anything that we end up doing consciously to attempt to get a better result. This is different than just the appearance of creativity. We're going to see that I'm going to be talking about how this is somewhat simplistic, but also quite useful, and it helps to understand. Mostly creativity happens at the level of questions, not at the level of answers. So it's not really the case that there's creative answers. It's more what does the creating is the question in the first place. And then it's like you're creating a magnet, right? The question is like creating a magnet, and then the magnet attracts what it attracts. And then let's say you create a magnet and then it attracts a bunch of iron filings, and all someone can see are the iron filings. And then they might say, oh, that design's pretty creative, but it's not the iron filings that were creative. It would have been the creation of the magnet in the first place. Okay. When we're trying to make life better, we want to focus on questions. One of the problems with school, one of the many problems, is that, like other places in our environment, it reinforces that we're rewarded for answers. Now, in the marketplace, we're also rewarded ultimately for answers. So our brain is going to go and see our subconscious mind. Little side lesson here, but this is very relevant. Our subconscious mind has its own version of cause and effect, and it's not correct or not, except for when it doesn't work. All right. And what your subconscious mind is always searching for cause and effect. And what it does is when it sees an effect, then it looks around and looks to see what's unique in the environment and that's also close to that effect in time or space. So if you get sick, then your subconscious mind is going to search around for what unique food you ate and most recently. And it's going to tend to make you not want to eat that food. Right. And of course, if you see a billiard ball, like a ball on a pool table, if your brain sees it move, then it looks around, sees the ball that was closest to it in space and time, which of course bumped into it. And it's going to say, oh, the cause of the second ball moving is because the first ball bumped into it. If you get upset, then your brain is going to look around in the environment and it's going to, what unique thing happened to the environment that's closest to me in time and space. And if it's a person saying something to you, then it's going to say, aha, the cause of me being upset is what that person did. And a problem with that, of course, is then it promotes helplessness because, in that particular case, there's a problem with all of these things, right? With the sickness thing with the food, your brain might have misidentified the food, but it's still functional, right? It can help you survive as well. It does the best it can on its own. And then what you need to do is interfere with it consciously in order to get it on the right track. So understanding that your brain is always looking for cause and effect in that way is key. And I started talking about the cause and effect thing with your subconscious because I was talking about in the marketplace when we're trying to make money, then we're going to get rewarded for the end result of asking creative questions. So our brain is going to go and see that we get rewarded for what looks like gets rewarded for something that's created, right? A product, service, a website, that sort of thing. So it's going to come to the conclusion that making things that are unique, or basically the creativity lies within and we'll call results creative. We'll look at a product and say, oh, that's creative. And so it misidentifies the source of the creativity. And that can be an issue because then we don't really realize how to get there. We start to try to make things that are new or unique or this sort of thing, when in fact, what we want to be doing is asking the right types of questions. And our solutions don't need to be particularly new or unique. I've had great success in strategy in my life. I like to play games and I've done very well, including on a world level with Magic, the Gathering and so forth with strategy games. And sometimes you innovate with strategy and you figure something that ends up looking creative to other people. But other times you just do something that's fairly mundane and realize, hey, this is so great to do. I'm just going to keep doing this. And you don't try to vary it up and just keep doing what's working. So sometimes something that's extremely effective might not look creative. But the fact was that good creative questions were asked and the answer just might look mundane. The next Avengers movie that comes out might not look creative to art critics. However, if the question is, how do we create a wonderful movie experience for lots of people, then it might be the perfect answer to that. All right. So it doesn't matter whether something's new or unique. What matters is the only meaning for creativity right now is that you're asking some sort of question to improve on whatever the default functioning would have been. Opening up a new space by asking a question in this creative sort of way does not guarantee you a better result instantly. It generally will guarantee you better results over time if you stick with it, but not in any one particular case, or even in many cases. You could go many times and your first 10 sales letters that you make after you make the one that would have just occurred to you by default might not outperform the default one, right? But you still are going to be, of course, far better off in life by asking the right types of questions. And it'll tend to be much better than that. In reality, asking the right question is going to lead to better answers pretty fast, pretty often. Now, I wrote that there's nothing wrong with improving on your mind's default settings. I wrote this for a reason, and that is because the cool thing is we like to be able to think quickly when possible, right? And we would like our default to be as great, to be as good as possible, which means that we have more good ideas, less bad ideas, right? We filter out bad ideas from our mind and we get more good ideas in there. And just going through the law of implication course, the full one, which you should definitely get if you haven't gotten it yet, what's wrong with you? And in everything that I'm showing you here as well. Then I'm giving you a whole bunch of useful settings, useful ideas that can then go into your mind. And you can come up with your default settings you come up with, even if you're not being creative, will be better and better. And of course, you can do that for yourself. You don't need me. I'll certainly help you and speed you along. But the more ideas you get right, the better you'll come up with the correct things by default. You don't need to be cliche. You don't need to reinvent the wheel if you've invented the wheel well. The problem is if people's wheels are not nice and, I don't know, hopefully analogies aren't going too far afield, right? But if our ideas in our mind aren't very effective for the situation, then we're going to need to be creative. Creativity takes time and conscious effort. And so ideally, we'll have our settings so right in our mind that we don't have to be creative all that often. Interestingly enough, being creative isn't necessarily an ideal. It's more of a necessity. When you are creative, which takes conscious effort and attention, then it actually depletes. Conscious effort and attention are actually kind of depleting to your whole system, your mind and so forth. So it gets actually less effective over time until you get some sleep and certain nutrition and so forth. And the goal isn't to just always be creative every moment. The goal is to, of course, the ultimate goal is just to be happy, not just to be happy, but to be perfectly happy and for everyone else to be perfectly happy. And along that way, the strategy is to get the default settings in your mind as good as possible. The goal of creativity is to be able to be less and less creative because you won't be necessary, right? The goal of inventing the wheel is to not have to reinvent the wheel. However, of course, until we have the wheel perfect, until we're perfectly happy, then we need to continue to ask better questions and come up and have answers come and improve on our default settings. And in order to do that, then we want to get plenty of sleep. You can really improve the quality of your life pretty well by just getting more sleep. Interestingly enough, when people sleep or if they drink, you can get what comes out more is their default settings, right? Because they'll be inhibiting their default settings more. They're better able to inhibit their default settings of just their attitudes and their responses and how they might act when they have had sleep or when they're not drinking. And someone who changes and is a jerk when they're drinking or when they haven't slept, what it shows is that their default settings are particularly off in that way. It doesn't mean they're more off than you because maybe you're less of a jerk in that way, but maybe you have other problems, right? Or other issues. Or myself, of course. I'd say that about myself. So I'm not saying that to be judgmental, but you can also see that in yourself. If when you don't get sleep, you're significantly more obnoxious, or when you drink, if you're more angry and mean, then that's a good indication that the default ideas in your brain and the wiring and so forth are off and that you want to improve on those and ask questions in order to do that. And of course, I'll be helping you greatly as you go through this whole law of implication course. Every result you want in your life, including to improve your default settings, you need to look at the implications of ideas. And if you want to make changes, you need to have inputs that imply the correct ideas to your brain. I want to mention a concept that I call driving out of San Francisco. I couldn't use any city for this, but just use San Francisco. And it's just a quick illustration of why this is useful for many reasons, but it illustrates why we want to pay attention to creativity and learn from this video, even if we get good results in our lives sometimes, or even if we think that we're quite creative. Okay, so let's say that you have someone drive randomly around the United States, then, and they don't know how to get to San Francisco, and they don't exactly understand San Francisco very well. They won't really know what it looks like. And they think, oh, well, maybe I think I'll recognize it when it happens. Anyway, but if they don't know what it looks like, then you say, if they drive randomly, won't they eventually end up in San Francisco? This is actually, I'm not going to dwell on this now, but this fallacy comes up all the time in evolutionary theory, where the people talk about the probability of getting to a certain result without realizing that the result would degrade after it happens. So the point with driving into San Francisco is if you don't recognize it, then even if you drive around randomly, even if you drive into San Francisco, what's going to happen is you'll drive back out. And a lot of people, they have success sometimes in their lives. And also in certain areas of their lives, they'll have more success than other areas. Like they might make a lot of money or have a fairly good career, or they enjoy their career, but then have a difficult time with their relationship. Or maybe they have a good relationship with their wife and their career is good, but they have difficulty with their kids, right? So if you don't know your methodology for creativity, which is going to be ultimately your methodology for success, then you'll drive into San Francisco in some place in your life, right? So to speak, you'll have success, but then you'll just drive right back out again other times. That's why if you sometimes have success with, let's say, sales and other times don't, if you don't know the methodology for it, then you'll do it sometimes, won't do it others, right? So even if you have a lot of success, you still want to focus in and really use that success to figure out the methodology. I'll also mention, just a little bit related, it's interesting whenever I notice a book or a teacher or a person, and they're trying to understand success purely by studying a successful example, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You want to also study an example of someone who seem to do a lot of the similar things, but then wasn't successful. So merely reading success stories can be misleading. And people can attribute to something that causes success that doesn't actually necessarily cause success. Because then if you look at people that weren't successful, they did that. And it reminds me of a pretty funny Saturday Night Live skit with Tina Fey as Sarah Palin, and I'm forgetting the other actress's name, but who played Hillary Clinton. And Tina Fey said that you just have to want it really badly. And Hillary Clinton had just lost she was like, yeah, that was my problem. I didn't want it badly enough. That's often one of the things people say with success, you have to want it really badly, but maybe other people want it really badly and don't achieve it. So you need to figure out what else is necessary. All right. So keep this in mind that unless you really know how to recognize something, you merely the fact that you've sometimes achieved a result, don't get overconfident. Instead, try to figure out the methodology very clearly. And I bring it up with creativity because, of course, you've been creative at times in your life, or at least what comes across as creative, but I'm not disputing that you also have been creative. But even if that's the case, it really pays to understand it deeply so that you can be creative whenever it's helpful and necessary. Okay, I'll go on to the next slide here. All right, this has a lot of wording on it, and it's going to help us to understand about how we want to interact with our brain and what it does and what it doesn't do. So our subconscious brain, think of it like a workhorse. I talked about this in the previous video. I didn't use the word workhorse, but it's very powerful. All right, but it's very useful. Once you ask the right questions, it can be quite useful in coming up with some creative answers, but it isn't going to come up with the questions that you need in many cases. Now, it can come up with questions within a range. Once you ask the right, basically it can come up if you think of let's say you ask a question that opens up a circle like this. If you ask a question, how do I make more money? All right, then your subconscious can come up within that circle, but it's not going to come up generally with questions that are outside that circle, to go deeper generally. It's generally not going to say, maybe can I make more money if my spouse treats me differently? It maybe somehow it might come up with that, especially if it heard it somewhere before, but it generally isn't going to ask questions that are deeper and outside of the circle that you open up, the space that you open up. So you want to put it to work. Now, and the other thing, of course, is that something I haven't mentioned yet. It's fairly obvious, but I just mentioned it for completeness. is that the more, I'm going to say knowledge for a second, then I'll try to, the more knowledge that your brain, that your subconscious gets, a great word is building blocks. The more good building blocks that your subconscious gets, then by far its answers. It's only going to be able to process what it already has inside of it. It's once you open up a space, it's only going to be able to help you fill that space with things that it's been exposed to. And so exposing it to useful building blocks. So if you're trying to create a sales or an affiliate matchmaking page, then getting onto forums and just getting a lot of inputs from people that could be not forums about sales, but forums about the product that you're selling or related, where people are asking questions. And the more you can get a sense of what some customers in that area are wanting and talking about, then that can be very useful. So generally asking the question of how can I accumulate more good building blocks. And it's pretty important to try to filter for good building blocks and not misleading ones. Obviously, if you have incorrect knowledge, then that can lead to obviously can make the process less efficient. What your subconscious is using that to help process and come up with answers. Even if you have some incorrect knowledge and your subconscious comes up with some incorrect answers, that's okay, because you're going to want, of course, also a feedback loop to see if the problem is really solved, and if it's not optimal, then you remember in the previous video, I talked about imagining a scenario that happens after you get the result that you want, right? So that's the law of implication method of defining the problem. And I just made kind of quotation marks with my fingers there about defining the problem. You know, people talk about your problem solving method. You want to define the problem. You actually don't exactly want to define the problem. That's approximately right. But by the law of implication, the correct thing to do is to construct a scenario in your mind of what the world would look like after the problem is optimally solved. All right. So if you're making a sales letter or an affiliate type of sales letter, intermediate communication between yourself and they come to you and you're an affiliate, you give them a communication and then you send them on to a sales letter to buy. If you're doing that, then you want to, instead of defining the problem, I want to make sales, instead you want to construct a scenario of what the world will look like after you've succeeded in coming up with the best response. The way it would look is that people come to your web presence, website or web page or Facebook page or whatever, and then they end up buying the product. And I don't stop there. The trouble, if people stop there, that's impoverished. It doesn't help the world and therefore yourself as much as it could. It implies something it implies that you're more helpless. It just carries a number of weak implications with it. If you don't go on to then imagine the customer after they purchase becoming successful, not just satisfied, but successfully solving their own problem with that product, right? So that is, instead of defining the problem with words, with the law of implication, we create a scenario that of how the world would be after the problem is optimally solved, like after the sales letter is optimally built. So then then I started talking about this because what if you come up with the wrong answers? That's okay, because you have clearly in mind what the world is going to look like when things are built properly. That's better. If you just defined the problem, then you could forget about that pretty easily, or it's much less effective and it's not in accordance with the right implications. Instead, if you have a clear idea in mind of what the world is supposed to look like after things are properly created, then you can just go and see if that's how the world looks. So is it happening that people are coming to your sales presence and then they're going on to buy in reasonable numbers? And then are they going on to becoming successful with the product? If that is, and you want some feedback and to have an understanding of whether that's happening or not, right? And if that's not happening very well, then you need to keep asking questions to get to where it is happening. Okay, so questions are vitally important. Questions are the evidence. They happen pretty much right after you do some sort of invisible thing consciously that's created and opens things up. One way to characterize that kind of invisible thing that you do consciously in order to come up with good solutions to useful problems in the sense that it's useful to solve the problem, then a simple way to put that is that you're seeking to what's true and good. And in doing so, you end up creating a question because the world doesn't look as you want it to yet. And I want to point out that important questions create important new spaces. So merely opening up a new space with a question isn't necessarily going to be helpful, because a useful question creates a useful new space, but a judgmental question is like a magnet for a space to get judgmental answers. A negative question is like a magnet for negative answers and effects. And petty questions are similar. The thing with petty questions also is they just take up space, right? It's like carbon monoxide is poisonous because it bonds with the same thing that that I believe oxygen, it bonds with the same thing that, if I have my facts right, then it bonds with your hemoglobin instead of oxygen, and it closes it off, where now the hemoglobin in your blood can't bond with oxygen, and you can't breathe properly. So in the same way, petty questions are poisonous because they take up space, not this kind of space. They take up they take up your creative focus, right? And spread it all out in really petty and irrelevant directions. So we want to pay attention to the questions that we're asking. If we're just having conversations about people and just started to ask questions about their lives that end up being petty, in the sense that what are we trying to make the world look like through our question? Do we have a clear, great result in mind? Not if it's a petty question. So then when you notice yourself asking petty questions, say, trying to put a stop to that and think, what's an important question I can ask instead? Okay, I will end this video here, and I have a few more things to say about this, and I'll talk about ways you can see that your brain will predictably go wrong by default that will help you to recognize when you could be creative and little red flags to be creative and so forth. I'll talk about that in the next video, which will be the third and I believe final part of the series, this little mini series on creativity.